Okay guys, so what we're talking about today is we're talking about imaginary numbers. So a couple of just introductory things about imaginary numbers. So not all quadratic equations are gonna have real number solutions, okay? So, and the reason for that is because you can't square root a negative number. So x squared is equal to -1. It's not gonna have a real solution or equal to any negative number because like I said, you can never square root a negative number, okay? So when you have that, this is when you know you have to use imaginary numbers. So if you're going along solving and you need to square root a negative number, you need to use imaginary. Okay, so then the imaginary unit, or just I, is defined as I is equal to the square root of -1, which then makes I squared equal to -1. So we're gonna use both of these. We'll use I squared is equal to -1. So we'll be substituting things back and forth. So we could change out I squared for -1 and make whole numbers, or we can change out the square root of -1 for I and make imaginary numbers, okay? So it just depends on what you're given, but we'll need to use both of those. So like I said, I is equal to square root of -1, I squared is equal to -1. Okay, so let's go ahead, let's practice a couple, just changing things out. So if I see something like the square root of -5, what I need to do with that is, so I have the square root of -5. I can break this apart into the square root of 5 times the square root of -1. So you can break any square root of a negative number into the square root of the positive number, so whatever the number is, times the square root of the negative number, because these are the same exact thing, we just broke it down. Okay, then we also know that the square root of -1 is I, so I can switch this out to be I. So I would have the square root of 5I. Okay, so then that would be like your answer, okay? So I know right now these seem confusing, but so you would say like x equals the square root of 5I. That would be your answer, okay? We couldn't leave it like this because we can't leave negatives in under our square roots because that's not okay. So you have to switch it out so that you would have an answer with I. Questions? Okay, so this next one, let's go ahead and we'll practice. So it is I square root of 5 squared. So I can go ahead and square both of these because they're multiplied together. So I'd have I squared, so I'd have I squared. And then the square root of 5 squared. And Braden, what's the square root of 5 squared?
Five.
Yeah, just 5. Yep, because the square root and the squared cancel each other. So I will be just left with 5. So I'd have I squared times 5, because this is like multiplied in here. So I times the square root of 5, and then this whole thing is squared, so I would square each piece. So I have I squared and 5. Now what can I switch I squared out for? Jade, what do you think? So what'd you say? So instead of doing that, could we switch it out for a number?
Yeah.
What number? Anybody help her out from the? Yeah, -1. So I squared is equal to -1. So these are our rules. I squared equals -1, and then I equals the square root of -1. Those are the things we can switch out. So I squared we can switch out for -1 times 5, which that's gonna give me what, Faith? Yeah.
Oh, -5.
Yep, perfect. So for this one, once I simplify it all out, I just end up with a -5. Okay, so sometimes you'll start with i's and you can get rid of them and you can get nice numbers, okay? So you always just have to simplify as far as you can go. Questions on the second example? All right, let's try this third one. So this one I have 5i squared. Cooper, what do you think I can do with this one?
Plug -1.
Yeah, plug -1 in for my I squared. So then what am I gonna have?
-5 squared.
Will I still have the squared if my I squared is equal to -1? Yep, so just -5. Yep, so for this one, all I had to do was switch out my I squared for -1, and then those are multiplied together, so I'm gonna have -5. Okay, so same answer that I had over there, it just started a little bit differently, but both of them simplified to -5. So yeah, so if you remember, these are our two rules that you're gonna use when you're simplifying, okay? So you should never end with like a negative square root. We can have square roots, like we can have a positive under our square root. We just can't end with a negative under our square root, okay? We would have to switch it out for I. Okay. So this is where these actually come from. So they come from when we're solving quadratics and we end up with the negative under our square root. So let's go ahead and solve these. So the first one I have x squared is equal to 16. So in order to solve these, I know that we used factoring in the last section, but if you just have x squared and a number, you can just use like square rooting. Like get your x squared all by itself and then square root it, okay? So you don't need to factor or anything like that. So Caden, if I have x squared equals 16, what should I do?
Square root of 16 -4.
Yeah, square root of the 16 and -4. So I'd get x equals 4. Well, down here, I have this little note. It says whenever you square root x or x squared, you need plus or minus because 4 squared is what? 16. What's -4 squared? 16. So every time you square root, you need plus or minus because you need the positive and the negative. Okay, because there are two answers. Okay, and these are our x-intercepts. And if you think with quadratics, most of the time, if like our quadratics like this, you have two x-intercepts. So it makes sense that you have two answers. Okay, so every time you square root, you need plus or minus. So don't forget that, okay? So yeah, so for this first one, our solution would just be positive or -4. I didn't need any imaginaries. We ended up with positive for all of those, so that's fine. But these next ones, we might need some imaginary. Okay, so the next one I have 2x squared plus 9 is equal to -41. So I want to go ahead and try to solve this, and I'm trying to get x all by itself. Haley Burry, what do you think I could start with?
Would you square root by 2?
Square root all this right now?
I think so.
So before I would do that, the square rooting is going to be like the last step. So we want to get all our numbers on the other side. Yep, let's go ahead and minus the 9. So -41 minus 9 is what, Haley? Yeah, -50. So I have -50 is equal to 2x squared. Okay, so this is just like we're solving for x. So you do like your addition and subtraction stuff. Then we'll go ahead and divide by 2 because we'll do all the multiplication division, and then you'll square root because we can't square root right now. You can't square root until you have x squared all by itself. Okay, so let's go ahead, let's divide by 2. And then Faith, what would I have?
X squared equals
Yeah, -25. So then Paige, what could I do after that?
20 rid of the squared.
Okay, so to get rid of the squaring, I can square root, right? So the square root of x squared would be what, Paige?
X.
Yep, just x. And what do you think about the square root of -25?
5.
Okay, so we think it's gonna be 5, right? But because I have this negative, we need to break this apart into, just like we did right here, we'll break it into two separate things, okay? So when you have a negative under your square root, let's break it apart into the positive So the square root of 25 times the square root of negative 1. Okay, so that can be your first step. Every single time you see a negative under your square root, you can break it apart into those two separate square roots, because we know that our square root of negative 1 is I. So I automatically can switch that out. So I know that this part's going to become I. Well, then my square root of 25, Mia, what's that?
5.
Yeah, 5. So I'm going to have x equals 5I. Did I forget anything?
Plus or negative?
Yes, plus or minus, exactly, because when I square rooted, I need a plus or minus. So I have both positive and negative 5I as my solutions. So plus or minus 5I. So every single time you have two solutions, so you should never have one. So like a little trick is, whatever your highest exponent is, that's how many answers you should have when you solve it. So as we progress in the year, when we start doing like cubics, you're gonna have 3 answers. Or when we do like quartics, you'll have 4 answers, okay? So whatever your exponent is, that's how many answers you should have. Okay, so just a little trick. All right, let's do another one for some more practice. All right, so we have this time, we have 3x squared plus 10 is equal to negative 26. Jade, go ahead and help me out. What would I start with? Okay, let's minus the 10, so what would I have? Okay. Keep going, what would I do next? Okay, so what would I have? Okay, so I have x squared equals negative 12. And then what could I do? Okay, so what am I gonna have?
12 and negative 1.
Yeah, square root of 12 times my square root of negative 1, because I can break those two apart. Do I know what the square root of 12 is? I don't know what it is, so we can just leave it as the square root of 12. So we'll just leave it. So if it's not a nice number, just leave it as is. You don't need to turn it into a decimal or anything like that. So square root of 12, and then Mackenzie, what would I change out for my square root of negative 1? Yeah, I. Did I forget anything, Katie?
Shouldn't there be a negative on the 12 in the second?
So we have the square root of negative 12, so we broke it into the square root of 12 and the square root of negative 1.
Well, wouldn't the last one be negative?
So this would be positive 12, so this just carries down, and then our square root of negative 1 is I, so it would just switch out for I. So I'm just missing my plus or minus in front here, so I'd have like 1 positive and 1 negative. What's your question, Kaden?
Still makes no sense.
Okay, what are you confused on? Where, like,
Because
what
you have
step?
to- You're leaving 2 variables. But
Two,
then
we just have x.
that still doesn't make any sense though. 'Cause
Oh,
then
like x and I?
Because when you have to plug in,
This is our answer. So I isn't a variable. I stands for like it's an imaginary number. It's like part of the number. So it's nothing you would ever solve for. You wouldn't have like I equals. So are you okay up to here how we got x squared
Yeah.
equals negative 12? Okay, so then are you okay, square root of x squared is x?
yes.
Okay, so square root over here, when you square root a
Yeah.
negative, we can break it apart into the positive times the square root of the negative.
Yeah.
You're okay here?
My issue is the last one.
Okay, so we brought down the square root of 12, and then the square root of negative 1 is equal to I, so I just switched those out for each other. So then this became I.
I still don't get that portion.
Okay, you come see me later and we can do some more. But yeah, so basically, when we have the square root of a negative, we can break it to the square root of the positive times the square root of negative 1. You can just leave. Were you okay over here, Kaden?
No, same question.
Like, I don't understand like what you're confused
You're
on.
multiplying a positive times a negative. It should be negative.
But I'm not multiplying them, I'm
Yeah, you-
switching them out. I
But
just
it'd still be
substituted
the
them.
same thing though.
So the square root of -1 is equal to I. So I just switch it for
But
I.
I is still equal to -1, square root of -1.
Yeah, but so they're equal to each other.
She just flipped it.
I don't get it at all.
Just continue working.
Okay, alright, so yeah, so this one we should end up with our answer, so we have both the positive and the negative, square root of 12I. Okay, so yeah. Okay, and even though it's a positive times a negative, it's not a positive times a negative anymore. Because we switched out the square root of -1 is I, so it's just this, we just swapped it. Okay? We're past nice math rules, like, okay, so they're the same thing, they're equivalent, it's just like,
So then it's still gonna be the same thing, it's still gonna be negative.
no, it wouldn't be negative.
You just said they're equivalent.
Yeah, they're equivalent, so the square root of -1 and I are the same thing.
Yeah, so that number's gonna be negative.
Oh, it is, plus or minus. So I have a positive and a negative, square root of 12I. So I have a positive one and a negative one, okay? All right, so complex numbers, so what these are, they're gonna be numbers that take on the form A plus BI. So A is gonna be our real number, so that's the number without the i's. And then the BI is the imaginary number. So an example of something would be like 7 plus 4I. This could be a complex number because you have a real part and you have an imaginary part, okay? So it's just called a complex number. So if you ever need my red poster right above the turning baskets, that's all about imaginary numbers. It'll stay up for your quiz and your tests and everything like that, and it talks all about imaginary numbers, okay? So the real number is the A part, the imaginary is the BI, and the B just stands for the number that's in front of the I. So like I said, 4I or square root of 12I or whatever the number part is. And then the pure imaginary number, this is just gonna be if you don't have any real number, the number is just imaginary. So something like -4I or 6I. So when you don't have a real part, you just have the imaginary. Okay, so that's just a little terminology. So we'll talk about complex numbers the rest of the year, so. So we can add and subtract complex numbers. So when we add and subtract them, all we have to do is we add or subtract the real parts together and then do it with the imaginary parts. So for this first example, I have 4 minus I, and it's all one number, so that's why it's in like parentheses. And then I have plus 3 plus 2I. So all I need to do is add my real parts together and then add my imaginary parts. So Brayden, what am I gonna have?
I and 1.
So 4 plus 3 gives me,
Oh wait, 7.
you're subtracting.
Yeah.
And then negative I and 2I you said was?
I.
Yep, so I'm just gonna have 7 plus I. Okay, so my answer for this one, when I add and subtract them, I have 7 plus I. Questions on that first one? All right, let's do the second one. So I have 7 minus 5I, and this one's subtracting, so I have minus 1 minus 5I. So the only thing to be careful of is with the subtracting, you need to distribute that negative to everything. So really, it's like I'm taking 7 minus 5I plus negative 1 plus 5I. So if it helps you to first distribute your negative so that you don't forget that it's minus 1 plus 5I, so you don't do like minus 1 and minus 5I, you can always do it that way. So distribute your negative and change it to addition. And then we can just go ahead and combine our like terms. So if I do that, Haley, what would I have?
6 plus I.
Yes, so
Or
6,
minus 5. Or would it just cancel out?
it's just gonna cancel out.
Okay.
So yep, I have negative 5i and a positive 5i, so that would just give me 0i. So in this case, I just have a real number, so I'm left with just 6. Okay? All right, this last one, I have 6 minus negative 2 plus 9i. And then I have plus negative 8 plus 4i. All right, so first, what could I do with this minus? Jade, what do you think? Yeah, I could distribute it. So I'm gonna have 6 plus 2 minus 9i plus negative 8 plus 4i. So now even though I have 3 real numbers, I'm just gonna combine all of them together. So when I do that, Cooper, what would I have?
So I just combine the 2 and the 8.
So the 6, the 2, and the negative 8. So that's gonna be,
Just cancels.
yeah, just cancel. So I don't have any real numbers left. And then if I have negative 9 plus 4i, what would I have?
5i, negative 5i.
You have negative 5i. Okay? So for this one, I'm gonna have negative 5i. Okay, because the 6 and the 2 was positive 8, and then a negative 8, those canceled each other. So this one, I have no real numbers, and then I just have negative 5i for my answer. You guys feel okay adding and subtracting? It's just like we do with normal numbers, but just do the real numbers together and then the imaginary. All right, what about multiplying? So to multiply complex numbers, what we're gonna do is, depending on what the problem looks like, if it's something like this, you would just go ahead and distribute it to everything in the parentheses. But if you have something like this, where it looks like you need to FOIL, then you're gonna need to FOIL, okay? So the ways you're gonna multiply, you're either gonna distribute or you're gonna FOIL, okay? So we'll practice both methods. So for this first one, I have 5i and then negative 2 plus I. Mackenzie, what do you think I'm gonna do? Okay, so what would I have? Yep, you can.
Okay, so it would be negative 10i, and then
Yep, so 5i times I would give me 5i. Yep, exactly. So yep, so we're multiplying, so 5i times negative 2 was negative 10i, and then 5i times I gives me 5i squared. Now we're not done, because you can't end up with